The call lasted exactly 11 seconds. I had only phoned the bank to close an old account that belonged to my late husband. I expected paperwork, maybe a death certificate request. Instead, the manager suddenly went silent before saying 3 words that turned my entire marriage upside down. "Mrs. Carter, congratulations." I laughed because I thought he had the wrong account. Then he quietly asked me to come to the bank in person immediately. 24 hours later, I was staring at documents proving my husband, the man who insisted we were barely surviving on $500 a month, had secretly hidden $33 million from me. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed I knew every important thing about my husband. Looking back now, I realize I knew the man I loved, but not the life he was secretly living beside me. Daniel and I were married for 15 years. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom house outside Portland, Oregon. Nothing about our life looked unusual. We drove an aging sedan, clipped grocery coupons, skipped vacations, and celebrated birthdays with homemade dinners instead of expensive restaurants. Whenever friends talked about promotions or new homes, Daniel would smile politely before reminding me that his consulting business barely brought in $500 a month after expenses. I never questioned him. Instead, I picked up freelance graphic design projects late into the night. I postponed replacing my old laptop, ignored my dentist's recommendations, and quietly sold a necklace my grandmother had left me because Daniel insisted we needed every dollar to keep the mortgage current. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile because I believed we were fighting the same battle together. Then, 6 months ago, Daniel suffered a sudden heart attack while attending what I believed was a routine business meeting. He was gone before I reached the hospital. Grief has a strange way of delaying reality. For weeks, I could barely open a drawer without crying. Eventually, though, paperwork demanded attention. Insurance forms, tax documents, utility accounts. Life kept moving even when I wished it wouldn't. One rainy Saturday morning, I carried several dusty storage boxes down from the attic, hoping to organize whatever Daniel had left behind. Most of it was ordinary. Old receipts, warranty manuals, expired passports. Then, tucked inside a faded folder, I noticed a bank statement from an institution I had never heard Daniel mention. The account number meant nothing to me. The statement was nearly 20 years old, and the printed balance had faded so badly I couldn't read it. Assuming it was probably an abandoned account with only a few forgotten dollars inside, I decided the responsible thing was to close it. I found the customer service number, dialed it, explained that my husband had passed away, and gave the representative the account number. Then, the man on the other end stopped talking altogether. For several seconds, I wondered whether the call had disconnected. "Hello?" I asked. Nothing. I checked my phone screen. The connection was still active. Then I heard the man clear his throat. "Mrs. Carter?" "Yes." Another pause. His voice had changed completely. It sounded careful, almost formal. "Mrs. Carter, congratulations." I frowned. "I'm sorry. I need to ask you not to discuss this over the phone." My stomach tightened. "I only called to close an old account. If there's paperwork, just tell me what I need." "I'm afraid I can't explain the situation until we've verified your identity in person. Could you visit our downtown branch today?" The call ended 5 minutes later, but my mind kept racing. Congratulations? For what? I spent the entire drive imagining every possible explanation except the correct one. Maybe someone had stolen Daniel's identity years ago. Maybe the account carried hidden debt. Maybe there was a legal dispute connected to his estate. By the time I reached the bank, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. The receptionist greeted me politely before escorting me into a private office where the same manager from the phone introduced himself as Michael Reynolds. He offered coffee. I declined. He checked my driver's license, Daniel's death certificate, and several estate documents before logging into his computer. Without saying a word, he slowly rotated the monitor toward me. "I'd like you to confirm the account holder's name." I looked at the screen. Daniel James Carter. My husband's full legal name. Below it appeared a number so large my brain refused to process it. Available balance, $33,184,762.91. I actually laughed. There has to be a mistake. Mr. Reynolds didn't smile. There isn't. I shook my head. My husband told me we were struggling financially. He said his consulting business barely earned $500 a month. The manager folded his hands on the desk. Mrs. Carter, according to our records, this account has been active for over 21 years. The funds were accumulated through investments, business acquisitions, and long-term financial holdings. I couldn't breathe. Every late night I worked, every bill I worried over, every sacrifice we made, every one of them flashed through my mind at once. I stared at the screen again before whispering the only question that made any sense. Who was my husband? I barely remember driving home that afternoon. The number on the computer screen kept replaying in my mind like it belonged to someone else's life. $33 million. Not 300,000. Not 3 million. 33 million. The next morning, I returned to the bank with the estate attorney who had handled Daniel's will. I needed another witness because part of me still believed someone would eventually admit there had been an accounting error. Instead, every document confirmed exactly the same thing. The money was real, the account was legal, and it had belonged to my husband long before we ever met. Over the next several days, the attorney helped me review decades of financial records. Daniel hadn't hidden stolen money. There were no secret criminal investigations or unpaid taxes waiting to explode. The fortune came from early investments, business partnerships, commercial property sales, and company shares that had quietly multiplied over the years. Everything had been reported. Everything had been taxed. Everything had been carefully documented. The only thing hidden was the truth for me. I sat in that conference room remembering moments that suddenly looked completely different. The afternoon I sold my grandmother's necklace because Daniel said we couldn't afford another mortgage payment. The winter I worked freelance until 2 a.m. while he apologized for bringing home only $500 again. The anniversary when we canceled our weekend trip because he insisted every dollar mattered. The dentist appointment I postponed for almost 3 years because we supposedly couldn't spare the money. I had believed every word, not because I was naive, because he was my husband. The attorney quietly slid another folder across the table. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, your husband maintained the same financial pattern throughout your entire marriage. I opened the folder. There were investment statements dated almost every year we had been together. Millions continued growing while I worried about grocery budgets. Millions earned interest while I compared prices at discount stores. It wasn't one lie. It was thousands of small lies repeated so consistently that they became the foundation of our marriage. I closed the folder, unable to look at another page. The attorney hesitated before reaching into Daniel's estate file one last time. There is one more thing. He carefully placed a sealed envelope on the table. Across the front, in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. For Olivia. Open alone. My hands were trembling before I even broke the seal. For several seconds, I simply stared at Daniel's handwriting. I had seen those neat, familiar letters on birthday cards, grocery lists, and little notes he used to leave beside the coffee maker. Somehow, seeing them again hurt more than reading another financial statement ever could. I unfolded the letter. Olivia, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've finally discovered what I should have told you years ago. I swallowed hard and kept reading. Daniel wrote that before we met, he had watched his own family destroy itself over money. His parents had spent years fighting with relatives over inheritances, business ownership, and property. Siblings stopped speaking. Cousins sued one another. Holidays turned into legal arguments. According to him, every relationship eventually became a negotiation over wealth. He wrote that by the time he met me, he no longer believed anyone could truly love a wealthy man without wondering what they might inherit someday. So he made a decision. A terrible one. He would hide everything. He wanted to know whether someone could love him simply for who he was. At first, he planned to tell me after we became engaged. Then he postponed it until after our wedding. Later, he convinced himself he would tell me once we bought a house. Then, after we celebrated 5 years of marriage. Then, after 10. Every year that passed made the confession more frightening than the year before. His lies became easier to maintain than the truth was to admit. Near the end of the letter, the handwriting became less steady. You deserved honesty from the first day we built a life together. Instead, I gave you fear disguised as protection. I confused secrecy with safety, and by the time I realized what I had done, I no longer knew how to tell you without destroying everything we had. Tears blurred the final paragraph. I know an apology cannot return the years you sacrificed because of my silence. I only hope someday you'll understand that I never doubted your love. I doubted my own courage. I lowered the letter onto the table. For the first time since discovering the account, I cried. Not because I forgave Daniel, but because I finally understood that the greatest prison in our marriage hadn't been poverty. It had been the secret he never found the courage to escape. For nearly 6 months after Daniel's funeral, almost nobody from his extended family contacted me. A few sympathy cards arrived. 2 cousins attended the service. Then everyone quietly disappeared. That changed the moment the estate entered probate. The fortune couldn't remain private forever. Certain financial records became part of the legal process, and before long, someone started talking. Within a week, my phone became almost unrecognizable. Numbers I had never seen before filled my call history. Emails arrived with subject lines that began with family matters or important discussion about Daniel's estate. People who had ignored us for years suddenly wanted coffee. One distant cousin claimed Daniel had once promised to help him buy a business. Another insisted some investments had originally belonged to Daniel's grandfather and should be shared fairly. One woman introduced herself as a second cousin I had never heard Daniel mention. 5 minutes into our conversation, she was already explaining why family should always take care of one another. Not one person asked how I was coping. Not one person asked whether I still missed my husband. Every conversation somehow found its way back to money. The strangest encounter happened during a meeting with the estate attorney. A man named Richard arrived uninvited, claiming to represent several relatives. He smiled politely before saying, "These situations usually become much easier when everyone agrees to compromise." I looked at him. What exactly am I supposed to compromise? He cleared his throat. Well, $33 million is more than anyone needs. Before I could answer, my attorney calmly slid Daniel's will across the table. The estate is extremely clear, she said. Every asset passes directly to Mrs. Carter. There are no competing beneficiaries. Richard's confident smile disappeared almost instantly. After he left, my attorney closed the conference room door. "You don't owe anyone explanations," she said. "If people continue contacting you, let us handle it." Walking back to my car, I thought about Daniel's letter. For years, I believed his greatest mistake had been hiding the money. Now I understood something else. He had spent his life fearing exactly what I was witnessing. Money had become a magnet. It attracted voices, opinions, expectations, and people who suddenly remembered they were family. Standing alone in the parking lot, I realized wealth could bring attention overnight. But attention and love had never been the same thing. The first thing people asked after learning about the inheritance was what I planned to buy. A bigger house, a luxury car, a vacation around the world. The truth disappointed almost everyone. For months, I bought nothing. I kept living in the same house Daniel and I had shared. I drove the same aging sedan. I still compared grocery prices out of habit, and I still woke up some mornings expecting another freelance deadline because my mind hadn't caught up with my new reality. Money had entered my life overnight. Peace hadn't. One afternoon, I drove through the neighborhood where I'd spent years worrying about overdue bills. The little coffee shop owner, who used to let me pay a week late, was still there. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, was still tending flowers outside her porch. Neither of them knew anything about $33 million. They simply smiled because they were kind people. That drive reminded me of something important. The people who had stood beside me when I had nothing were the same people who deserved my gratitude now that I had more than enough. I met with financial advisors, accountants, and attorneys for months before making a single major decision. I wanted every dollar to reflect the kind of life I wished Daniel and I had built together, one rooted in honesty instead of fear. Quietly, without publicity, I paid off medical debts for families through established charities. I created scholarships for students studying graphic design who couldn't afford tuition. I funded emergency grants for widows rebuilding their lives after unexpected loss. Finally, after years of postponing my own health because we supposedly couldn't afford treatment, I scheduled every medical appointment I had delayed. For the first time in years, I chose myself without feeling guilty. One evening, I took Daniel's letter from the drawer where I had hidden it. I read it one final time. Then I placed it inside a wooden memory box beside our wedding photograph. The letter no longer felt like an unanswered question. It felt like the final chapter of a life built on love, fear, and silence. I couldn't change the choices Daniel had made, but I could decide what happened next. His fortune would never become another secret. It would become an opportunity to bring hope into lives that had known the same uncertainty I once carried every single day. Exactly 1 year after I discovered Daniel's hidden account, I drove back to the same downtown bank. The building looked exactly as I remembered. The polished marble floors, the quiet lobby, the private office where my entire understanding of my marriage had changed in a single afternoon. Mr. Reynolds recognized me almost immediately. He smiled warmly and asked how I had been. This time, I wasn't there to sign documents or ask questions. I simply wanted to thank the people who had treated me with honesty on the hardest day of my life. After a short conversation, I stepped back outside into the morning sunlight and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. A year earlier, I had walked into that building believing I was a struggling widow trying to close an old bank account. I walked out carrying $33 million. But somewhere along the way, I realized that the money had never been the biggest surprise. The real discovery was understanding how easily fear can become a prison. Daniel spent years believing that hiding his wealth would protect our love. Instead, it slowly stole the one thing every marriage needs more than money: trust. As I climbed into my car, my phone rang. It was Laura, my adoptive mother-in-law in every way that truly mattered after years of friendship, checking to see whether I wanted to come over for Sunday dinner with her family. I smiled without hesitation. Wouldn't miss it. Driving home, I realized something I wished Daniel had understood while he was still alive. Money can buy comfort. It can create opportunities. It can even change someone's future. But it can never replace honesty. The greatest inheritance my husband left behind wasn't $33 million. It was the reminder that love grows strongest in the light. The moment secrets replace truth, even the richest life begins to feel empty. And if I was ever remembered for anything, I hoped it wouldn't be the fortune I inherited. I hoped it would be the life I chose to build with it.